if you're anything like me, you're thinking about investing into studio monitors and you want to understand how they work so you can pick the right one for you. So today we're going to cover the 4 key things you need to understand when it comes to studio monitors. Welcome to another episode. I'm Marlok, singer-songwriter, music producer, and electronics engineer. And today is the day that we're looking into studio monitors, which is totally one of the key elements in your home studio. Studio monitors give you a much better picture of the music that you're producing or mixing, just because that's the way we used to listen to it. When you put your headphones on, your stereo image gets a little bit distorted, so everything is more present on either side, whilst with your monitors you actually get more of a wave of audio. And that's why today we're going to look into the 4 key elements of a studio monitor. We're going to start looking at the different parts of the studio monitor, and the most obvious first one is the box or cabinet, which obviously holds the entire assembly. Then the second part, perhaps not as obvious, is the crossover network. We'll look into all of this into detail in a second, but basically this is the electronics that actually separate your frequencies to send it to the different drive units, which is the next part. Drive unit or transducer. Transducer, basically what that means is that it changes what's effectively an electric signal that you get from your source into a mechanical signal, and then it turns it into an acoustic signal. That's why it's called a transducer. Drive unit, or even actual speaker, is the usual names that you hear around. Now that we've seen the basic parts of the speaker, we're going to delve into a bit more detail, and I'm going to tell you the 4 things that you need to take into account. So we're going to start the other way around, actually. So we'll start with the drive units and go all the way to the box and cabinet. First thing to understand is drive units, or which speaker does what. As you can see here, this is just a picture of an M-Audio, I think it's the A7X. So in this case, we've got high frequency driver, usually called tweeter. In this case, it's a ribbon tweeter. And then we got a mid-low driver, commonly known as a woofer. And then we've got those holes that are usually known as a bass reflex, a bass port, or vent. This is one of the other things that we're going to cover here because it is quite important. That's if you got what's commonly known as a 2-way speaker. So now we're going to look at a 3-way speaker, which they're also available in the market. In this case, it's a KRK, I think it's a Rocket 10 or something like that, PR10. I don't know. I don't really remember the model, to be honest with you. So again, you see the small one is the tweeter for the high frequencies. The middle size is what's called a mid-range driver. So in this case, you're going to split your high frequencies, your mid-range, and also your low-range driver or bass driver, which again is called a woofer. You see there that the smiley face sort of thing is again bass reflex or bass port. So the first key element is understanding this, which are the different drive units that your monitor has. Moving into the next one, crossovers. So as we said, crossovers is what actually separates the frequencies so they can be supplied to your different speakers, right? And this is one of the secret sources that different speaker manufacturers have. Where exactly do they place the crossover, and what type of filter do they put to actually separate those frequencies? Again, looking at the same speaker, which is a 2-way speaker, as we said, you get the tweeter, you get the woofer, and to separate the tweeter frequencies, what you do is to add a high-pass filter. This is usually in the specs of the speaker, so it'll tell you HF usually, so that's the high-pass filter, or HPF, and it'll give you a frequency. And then same with the low-pass filter, you'll see LF or LPF in some of the data sheets or some of the data manuals of the speaker. So what this basically does is to tell you from X frequency up, those are the frequencies that the tweeter is going to radiate. And from Y frequency down, those are the frequencies that the woofer is going to radiate. Now, you see here that there's a bit of an overlap, because if you just separated frequencies, you would have a little bit of a gap in the middle, because the filters are not a brick wall. They actually have like some rollout. So there are certain frequencies in the system that are reproduced by both speakers in a different measure. Again, depending on how this is set up, that changes the sound of the speakers. On the through speaker, very similar. The tweeter, you still have that high pass filter, and those are the frequencies that are fed to the tweeter. For the mid range, though, you've got a bandpass filter, which means it's just a selection of frequencies. So you'll choose something that is in between the frequencies for the tweeter, which are only the high ones, and the frequencies for the woofer, which are only the low ones. And what happens effectively is that you get something like this, where you've got two different crossovers. So now that we understand what a crossover does conceptually, let's jump into the next key element, which is passive versus active. And this is also related to the crossover and how the crossover is done, but it's also applicable at system level. And this dictates the kind of components you're going to need in your system to run your studio monitors. If you decide to go and buy a set of passive monitors, you're going to need an external amplifier. So that will be amplifying the signal that is fed from the source to the speakers, and then the passive monitor, the passive speaker, will have passive crossovers. So it will have a high pass filter, as we said, for the tweeter, and a low pass filter for the woofer. Or if it's a three-way, you get the three filters. Then you can decide if you power both of them with the same amplifier, or if you use two different amplifiers to power the woofer and the tweeter separately, which is called bi-amping. And the other option is to buy an active monitor. So what that means is that you get the source, and then your active monitor already includes all of this. So you have a power amplifier for your tweeter, you got a power amplifier dedicated to your woofer, and then the frequency divider, which is the crossover effectively. That's usually done in a DSP or digital signal processor. So all of this is taken care by the speaker manufacturer, and that means less headaches for you, and it's usually tuned to sound a certain way and to give you a flat response in frequency, which is what you want with studio monitors. So what's better, active or passive? There isn't really an answer. It depends, right? If you've got a really good power amplifier and you're very knowledgeable about it, or you're looking for certain sound, it might be a better solution for you. You can have different dedicated amplifiers for, your different drive units. You can choose what goes where, so it gives you a higher amount of flexibility. I think if you're starting out, I would recommend an active monitor, because you don't have to worry about any of those things, like power requirements, power levels, how is that amplifier going to affect your frequency response, etc. Because at the end of the day, if you have really crappy monitors but a really good amplifier, your system is going to sound as good as the crappy monitors sound. If you have really good monitors but a crappy amplifier, the system is going to sound as good as the crappy amplifier sounds. So the worst part of the chain is always going to be your bottleneck. Moving into the last part of it, which, if you remember, was the cabinet or the box. Here, what I wanted to mention is that obviously the box, the cabinet, has an actual effect on the frequency response. And that depends on the materials. You'll see some of them are made out of metal, some others are made out of wood, and some others are made out of plastic. So that material actually has an effect. The dimensions and shape have an effect on how it sounds. the position of the drive unit have an effect on how it sounds, but I'm going to say don't worry about any of those because you just need to listen to the speakers and see if they're adequate for you. And also you can always look at the manual to see frequency response, etc. But the one that is important is the bass port or the bass reflex. And I'm going to explain you why in a second. So obviously, as I said, all of this has an effect on frequency response, but we're going to focus on that bass port. And just to explain what it is, if you were to have a speaker which is just a sealed box with your drive unit, it would look something like this. When you see a hole with a vent or what's called a ported system, it basically has a bass reflex. And that is to increase the frequency response of the bass. So this is important to understand, and it is important when you choose your speakers. And it's more about the placement of them. But let me go into the concept of the bass reflex and how it works, and then I will explain why that is a key element when choosing your studio monitors. So we're looking here at an example of the different frequency response depending on if your cabinet is sealed, as we saw earlier, or if you got the bass reflex. So this is 100 Hertz. So as you can see here, that bass has started to roll over very nicely already, and that means you get a big drop at about 10, 20, 50 or so hertz, right? You already get about 10 dB difference, give or take. So you're not going to have a lot of bass with that at, say, 50 hertz, 60 hertz, which is a quite key frequency when you do mixing. By putting a bass reflex or a vent in there, as you can see, it increases your bass response and basically makes the filter of a higher order. So it decays quicker, but you get that bump in here. So it's kind of like you don't lose as much bass so quickly. And when it actually starts to decay dramatically, it's at, say, 30 hertz or so, which most of us cannot really hear. So it's not as key as those frequencies in this part here. That's the benefit that it brings. Basically, it lifts up your bass response. How does that happen? Your speaker actually radiates not only to the front, but also to the back equally. So the idea of this is that you go and channel all that sound that comes through the back of your speaker and re-channel it forward. So obviously this has to be designed properly and accurately because the length of this has to be like a quarter of the wavelength, just so these two things are in phase, because otherwise you would get your front radiation and the radiation from the bass reflex out of phase, and you'd be actually losing bass instead of gaining bass. But the basic concept is that you just take what the speaker is radiating backwards and re-route it forwards. So here's an example of PMC's advanced transmission line. This is exactly what we're talking about, right? I mean, they got a bit more of a fancy system, but it's basically a bass reflex, and then they do some absorption. So, you know, they can absorb inside also like the mid frequencies on the highs, so you don't get them around, and they can kind of like tailor only the bass frequencies that they want to put forwards. So I just thought it was a nice way to show it. Nice picture. That's all. Okay, and now that we know what those four key elements are, can we look at a manufacturer's manual or just picture or something so we can see how this is useful? That's what we're going to do now. So I'm looking at a picture that I found on the M-Audio website. So these are for the Bx5. I thought it was very interesting because it covers all the topics that we talked about. So as you can see, Class AB, that's the type of amplifier that it has, is bi-amp, which means it's got a different amplifier for the tweeter and for the woofer, with 100 watts, so 60 LF, so 60 watts go into the woofer, 40 watts go into the tweeter, right? Which again is highlighted here. So 1-inch dome tweeter and then 5-inch Kevlar woofer. Also, something to note, it says exclusive design focuses high frequency dispersion, right? This is where I was talking about your design actually matters. So you see this sort of like horn design quite a lot to basically get a bit more dispersion in the high end, because otherwise your high end is very directional, whilst the low end is actually kind of omnidirectional, so it goes in every direction, but your highs don't. Your highs go wherever you point them at. So that kind of like waveguide to try to kind of like spread that high end a little bit more. So we obviously know this is an active speaker because we saw the amp specs here. So that's why you get a power button, a volume button, etc. Very important, the port. And this is why I emphasize that it's something important to understand. If you have your rear port facing back, right? Or if you actually are in a small room, you most likely gonna end up putting your speakers very close to the wall. And that's recommended to do in a small room. We'll talk about that in another video. But basically, by putting your rear port next to the wall, you're actually amplifying that bass even more. So it's commonly said that it increases your bass response about 3 to 6 dBs. This is a bit challenging, so that's why you see here this acoustic space control. So that has a -2 dB and a -4 dB kind of like option. That is in case you have rear facing ports and you put your speakers against the wall. If the bass is too loud, you have to go and tweak it, and with that switch, you can actually decrease your bass response to get something a bit more flatter.
Wait a second, are you a flat earther?
Now, if you want to be kind of like safer and out of trouble and not have to worry about that, go and look for a speaker with forward-facing vent. Like the other M-Audio that we saw earlier, or the KRKs as well, they all have the vent facing forward, so you don't get this problem when you put them against the wall. And I think we've covered with this all the different elements. So as you can see, this is quite applicable, and that was the idea of it, and hopefully it will help you when you're choosing your studio monitors. Thank you very much for watching. If this was useful, please do me a favor and click that like button. Tell me in the comment section which part was the most useful to you, and also any ideas on future topics that you might want me to cover. And with that, I will see you very soon.